Hello, welcome to today's lecture on Chapter 3, which is all about interests and goals that we have during conflict interactions. Our agenda today includes 4 different items. First, we are going to start today's lecture by looking at different types of TRIP goals. Hopefully you've already had a chance to look at your chapter and you know that the textbook authors identify 4 different goals that commonly occur within an interaction, and they conveniently fit into this little acronym, TRIP. So we'll start by identifying and defining each one of those goals, and then we'll spend some time talking about how those goals probably shouldn't just be discussed independently, but in actuality, those goals really tend to overlap. After that, we will talk about the ways in which goals can change before, during, and after a conflict. And then finally, we'll talk about issues related to goal clarity and how important it is for individuals to attempt to clarify their goals and some of the negative consequences that can come from just making assumptions about others' goals. So let's jump right in. So you can see here I've borrowed the visual right from your textbook, and it points out that in a conflict, individuals typically pursue 4 different types of goals. We have TRIP as our acronym to help us remember these goals. So the goals, of course, are topic, relationship, identity, and process. This is really just a preview slide to help identify those goals, but I have a couple of additional slides for each one of the goals to look at them more in depth. So let's go ahead and jump into that. So we'll begin with the topic goals. Topic goals are also known as content goals. Topic or content goals tend to be about different ideas about what to do or what decisions to make. They have to do with resource allocation or any really other types of like external and objectifiable issues. So some examples that come to my mind include things like money-related issues. How much are we going to spend for the new car? Or how much simply are we going to pay the babysitter? Topic goals can be about things like where are we going to spend the holidays? Are we going to be with your family for Christmas or with my family? That also makes me think of things related to maybe a divorced couple trying to make a custody arrangement. What night are the kids going to be with one parent versus the other parent? At work, I can think of, for whatever reason, I'm thinking here at my work, one content issue that's recently come up is whether or not faculty have printers in their office, right? And whether or not the university will pay for each faculty member to have their own printer. So anyway, you get the gist. My hunch is as I am talking about some of those examples, you're thinking about some of your own illustrations. One more that comes to mind that maybe is on your mind right now is things related to chores or division of labor. I know this has already come up some in this semester, right? Who has to do the dishes or who has to do the laundry? Okay, those are topics or contents that could easily be discussed. Again, content related goals are about things that can be easily listed. You can make pro-con lists, right? They can be talked about and discussed, and frankly, they tend to be what the majority of content discussion is about. They tend to be what we focus on, whether it's a good thing or not, we'll discuss here in a moment. All right, our second type of goals are called relational goals. And relational goals are, of course, all about how we relate to other people, what the relationship looks like, how we want to be treated. Right? Relationship goals tend to be about how much influence we think we should have over others or how much influence others should have over us. Those relate to issues of respect or affection. Right? Frankly, relational goals tend to be at the heart of all conflict interactions, even though they tend to be particularly tricky to discuss. Right? I think there's a really interesting quote in your textbook on page 85 that really gets at this issue. And the quote says, "Every statement we make carries a relational component. And I think as people who are in communication classes, you have probably thought about that before, and that probably makes sense to you, yet it's still something that maybe we take for granted. Again, on page 85, near that quote, I love how the textbook authors take a very simple issue of shutting the door, and they show how a simple phrase that's either a command or a question about shutting the door can carry with it so much relational content. Right? It can be perceived as a demand. It could be perceived as a polite request. It could be perceived as kind of a clueless statement. All of this background information can be involved in a very simple phrase regarding shutting a door, a simple task. So imagine how complicated, or we know how complicated then things can get kind of in real life situations. All right, so we've got the topic goals, we've got these relational goals. Our third goals that typically come up in a conflict are identity goals. Identity goals involve within the interaction, how people feel about themselves and their own identity, as well as what they think about the other person and their identity. And certainly identity goals can also be very, very complicated. Right? There are some interesting things we know about identity goals, including the fact that once the conflict becomes about one's own identity, then people really tend to be less flexible and really tend to focus in on that, and ultimately often wind up using more destructive types of behaviors. When you focus in on your identity, it tends to kind of be that right fighting type of behavior. I just want to come out on top, and I just want to be the winner. I want to be right. And so when you start focusing on that type of stuff, it's easy to lose sight of the other issues, the actual topic or the relational stuff. I'm sorry, I'm going to share a couple different examples here. So a couple of things I want to bring up. First one is that we know that when identity goals are the focus, another thing that tends to happen is that people tend to become more set in their ways and less likely to change a position, even in light of new information. So again, it becomes about sticking to my own opinion and my own side rather than actually listening to a conversation or having a dialogue to potentially change ideas. Frankly, I'm on a volunteer organization right now, and as a committee member on this organization, it's really interesting because I see what I've just described happen a lot. There are two pretty strong-willed individuals on the committee, and they don't necessarily always get along, and they don't necessarily always, I think, see eye to eye on issues, even though ultimately I think they have kind of common end goals. But what I tend to witness is that if one person brings up an idea, immediately the other person is inclined to be critical of that idea, disagree, and point flaws in it, right? Even if maybe if it was brought up by somebody else, this person would be on board, right? But it's really become about kind of which team they are on, which side they're on, which color jersey they're wearing, right? And that identity rather than actually discussing the content. Maybe you can kind of relate to that, right? Your book uses a term called the identity trap to also kind of relate to some of this. And what they talk about when they discuss the identity trap is that when we focus really on the identity issues, then what happens is that makes us less able to focus on constructive problem solving, right? Again, it becomes about right fighting. One other thing I would add to that is try to tie this idea of identity goals back to a previous lecture when we discussed attribution theory, and specifically we looked at that self-serving bias. If you recall, the self-serving bias basically suggested that we tend to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt and cut ourselves some slack, and we tend to judge others more harshly. So you can see how, you bring all the stuff that I just mentioned into play, and then you kind of also add into this idea that most of us, have this self-serving bias. Then you can imagine, how complicated these issues become. Okay, the last example I have, or the goal I have to discuss here is the idea of process goals. Process goals, of course, are simply about deciding how you're going to manage the conflict. It's kind of a meta idea here, right? There's at least the potential that you could have conflict about how you handle the conflict, right? I mentioned in previous lectures, again here, I mentioned just kind of a personal anecdote where I said that I tend to be pretty extroverted, and I tend to like to have conversation and feel like the conversation helps me process. But I mentioned my husband tends to be more introverted and more of an internal processor, and kind of often prefers to kind of think independently and process issues that way and come back together. And I think this is a really good example of how different kind of process goals could potentially lead to conflict, right? I often hear myself saying, why don't you just want to talk about it? Why won't you not talk to me? You must not care. That's really not true. It's just assumptions I'm making. Whereas he says things like, I wish you would quit trying to make me talk about this. We talk in circles about this over and over again, right? And so, again, anyway, that's just an illustration of we just have different goals in terms of how we want to process whatever the current issue might be, right? And how sometimes you can have conflict about how to manage the conflict, right? Okay, so again, it's important that you are familiar with these 4 different types of goals that can occur in conflict. I do want you to be able to define and provide some examples of the topic, the relational, the identity, and the process goals. However, with that being said, that's can't stop there, right? Because I need to point out that these goals are definitely overlapping. And within one conflict, odds are you have multiple goals. Some of these goals may take priority, some of these goals may take a back seat, but it's probably really unrealistic to think that in any one conflict you're only going to have, one major goal. Again, I've borrowed this example from your textbook here, or at least the picture from your textbook. And what the picture is trying to describe is the goals a student might have when trying to approach a professor about raising their grade. So in that situation, it's possible, it's maybe likely, that the priority the student might have is a topic goal. Specifically, their goal is probably to get a better grade. Right? That's something that's easy to talk about. It is external to the person, and either the grade is raised or it is not raised. Right? But with that goal in mind, the student probably also has some other goals that are important to them. Right? From a relational standpoint, they want to be listened to and validated and respected by the professor. Ultimately, they want their instructor to take them seriously. And there's probably also some identity goals in mind there as well, right? To be honest, I actually had an interaction this semester, or in the winter semester, that I think is really relevant to this. And it was an issue related to AI, and what I identified was an academic integrity violation. When it was brought to the student's attention, she reached out to me, and we chatted on a couple different occasions. Initially through email, and then we were able to chat face to face. And in all of those interactions, what I noticed was the very first things the student said to me was a reiteration of, I'm a really good student. I am a good student. And then lots of examples to support that claim. And frankly, she was a good student, right? In my class, she had, in fact, done great up until that point. So I had witnessed that myself, but then in our conversation, it was really important to her that I thought of her as a good student, and that I didn't let this particular incident with this one specific example tarnish her identity. So in that case, similar to this one, her ultimate goal was to get her grade raised, or to change the grade that she initially got due to the academic integrity violation. But that was not her only goal, right? She also had this relational goal, and then certainly had an identity goal. In this picture, your book does not mention process goals, but I think that we could probably add that in here. In this situation, it would be likely that there were some process goals involved, whether that involved the channel of communication that was used. Experience tells me that a lot of times students might prefer to not have to have difficult conversations face to face and would prefer to have those conversations through email or Teams or something like that. And so any kind of issues related to how the conversation is going to go would certainly be a little small P that could be added to that picture. Your book adds another way of thinking about that very same conflict, but this time by the professor's perspective, and I've included that visual here. In this case, you can see the professor is having this conversation with the student, and they are also going to have a variety of goals, right? The book suggests that perhaps in this case, the professor's priority is actually based on the relational goal that they want to maintain a positive relationship with the student and avoid pulling rank, right? Simultaneously, though, the professor may have some other goals going on, right? They may be trying to figure out how to come up with an outcome that also allows the students to earn good grades, and yet also allows the professor to feel like they are a fair professor and that they are in fact treating all students fairly and not, maybe favoring one student over the other. So ultimately, these pictures are really just trying to point out that in any conflict interaction, there are a lot of balls to juggle, right? And some goals might be prioritized and be bigger balls to juggle, and some goals might fall to the background a little bit and be a little bit smaller. But in a real life situation, it's important to acknowledge that conflicts are going to involve all four of these different goals. Okay. One final picture related to that I wanted to point out is kind of an interesting phenomenon that I think commonly happens, and that is in a conflict, we typically focus on the topic or perhaps the process, but it's very easy for us to kind of ignore or kind of shove kind of under the rug the identity and the relational goals. And this is just one picture from your text. Your book also has some pictures on page 96 and 97 that might actually be even a little bit better visuals, where they kind of show like a little dotted line, and then beneath that they have the identity and the relational goals. And I think that's a really important thing to point out. I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is, why is that? Why is it so hard for us in a conflict to talk about issues related to identity and the relationship or what we mean to each other? If we were in class right now and the lecture was synchronous, I would love to hear your responses to that question. But my hunch is that the responses in one way or the other would basically suggest that issues related to our identity and our face, issues related to our relationship and what we mean to each other are personal, right? Are sensitive. They just simply are kind of hard to talk about. Whereas it's much easier just to argue about whether or not we're spending Christmas with my family or your family, right? And it's much easier to talk to my boss about the fact that I do need a printer, or maybe he says I don't need a printer, versus to talk about issues of respect and esteem and those kind of things. Right? So honestly, if you found yourself in situations before where you and another person are kind of engaged in this conflict interaction, and at some point you ultimately are asking each other, why are we even fighting about this? Odds are what might be happening is you found yourself focused on a topic or some kind of content that may have felt important at the moment, but it's probably not really what the main issue is. What the main issue is that underlying relational and identity stuff that you've been kind of circling or afraid to discuss. This came up in our last chapter, and it's come up again in this chapter, and it's this notion of these serial arguments or these perpetual conflicts, right? And so what tends to happen is when we only focus on the topic at hand, or even the process of how we're talking about it, but we don't dig deeper to look at the reasons behind that are related to our identity and our relationship, then we keep having that serial argument, or that conflict turns into a perpetual one, because we never really get the actual resolution that's necessary. Maybe we get through the holiday and we have figured out which house we would be at for one night and which house we'd be at for the next night. Maybe we get through the semester and either you get the printer or you don't get the printer. But that relational stuff, that identity stuff that is influencing those particular topics, if that is never really discussed or talked about, then it's bound to surface again just with the next issue or the next topic. All right, so anyway, really good discussion of the 4 different goals in the TRIP model. We'll do a couple more exercises related to that during class, but hopefully those are clear in your mind and hopefully you can relate to those. But one other way to think about goals is the idea that in general, whether we're talking about topic goals or relationship goals or identity goals, when we are interacting in a conflict, we know that goals can evolve. And so your book describes prospective, transactive, and then retrospective goals. So of course, prospective goals are the types of goals you have before the conflict starts. Maybe it's that internal dialogue that you're having in your head as you're kind of practicing the conversation. Okay? Or maybe it's the list of pro cons that you've written out, again, prior to the interaction. Transactive goals are the goals that you had during the conflict interaction. And even these goals can evolve and change, all right? I'm just going to give it a generic example here, but I can't tell you how many times I have kind of gone into a conversation and thought, okay, my goal is going to be to get my point across about this, which probably in itself is probably kind of problematic, right? Goals should usually be, let me find out what the other person is thinking as well. But anyway, I go into the conversation, I say, here's my goal, and then I met with some kind of resistance, or maybe what I perceive to be a lack of respect, or some type of negative behavior that I don't, for whatever reason, like. And then what happens? Oh, I'm not going to lie, I'm guilty of this. Often then my goal is no longer focused on the issue I originally went into the conversation focused on, but now my goal is to stick it to the other person, right? Or, to win against that person, right? So that would be an illustration of during the conflict, my transactive goals can change. Okay? And then retrospective goals, of course, are goals after the interaction. To me, the best way to simply think about this, or the most common way to think about how we handle our retrospective goals, is the idea that people are really good at justifying the decisions that we make. We're all kind of guilty of this. If you have ever heard of cognitive dissonance theory or talked about that, maybe even in Com 405, then you're probably already familiar with this idea. But yeah, a lot of times we after a conversation, after a conflict, we will often justify various decisions that we make, right? I'm thinking, about a situation where maybe the conflict was about how much money to spend on something, whether you are buying a new car or, I don't know, maybe going on a trip and planning a vacation, and maybe you and the person you're talking with don't see eye to eye about how much money to spend. After the conversation, you realize that you just maybe agreed to spend a lot more than you originally thought. My hunch is your internal dialogue is going to really justify that decision. You're probably telling yourself things like, well, I deserved that. Well, I really want to make sure the car was safe, and in order to do that, we need to spend more. Well, I can't control airline prices, and so, we had to make sure to pay this much, or whatever that might sound like. There's just kind of a really common pattern as human beings that we retrospectively do a lot of mental effort to justify decisions that we make. All right, so I'm about out of time here, so I'm going to kind of quickly cover the last 2 slides. This particular slide focuses on how important it is to clarify one's goals, and yet also be careful when trying to assume or estimate another person's goals. In a lot of ways, this slide continues to or asks us to continue thinking about what we talked previously in class regarding intent versus impact, right? And we talked about how those do not always match. Often what happens in a conflict is we convince ourselves that we are correct in assuming another person's goals. And when we do that, as our confidence about what the other person's goals are goes up, our accuracy actually goes down. So the more certain we are that we know this person is acting this way because we know what this person wants, the more certain we are of that, often the less accurate our assumptions are. So I think it's really important to be kind of mindful of that, right? On the other hand, when we feel like we perhaps are not so confident about the other's goals, and in fact, we are actually willing to ask them about their goals and have an open conversation about that, then that actually is much more likely to help us come up with accurate descriptions of their goals. And finally, I just wanted to leave on this note. I hope that we talk about this a little bit more during our class session, but that is that how important it is, whether we are talking about topic goals or relational goals or identity goals or even process goals, is to focus on interests rather than just positions. And maybe you've seen this graphic of these icebergs before. It's a great illustration to help kind of describe what I mean here by focusing on interests versus positions. Because what it does is it points out that positions are described as people's kind of stance on an issue, or it's like a line in the sand that you might draw. Right? My position is I am not going to pay more than $2,000 for that car. Right? Or my position is I am not going to my in-laws' house for Christmas. Interests are the reasons behind those positions. Your interests are your why you've taken that position. And typically what happens is we focus on strictly positions, especially I think in this kind of Western culture where we view conflict as a win-lose situation. We typically focus on positions, and then most commonly we often may, find some kind of compromise. Well, we started with these two different positions, and then, success would look like us combining somehow or compromising somehow to meet somewhere in the middle. But what that means also is we both had to give up some of what we wanted. On the other hand, rather than focusing on positions, if we try instead to focus on interests, the reason why we have those positions, then we're much more likely to avoid just simply a compromise, but instead come up with some kind of collaborative solution that's actually a win-win situation where no one has to give up anything. And I have some examples of this. Again, I think I'll save those for class, but just quickly, I'll refer back to the fable I told at the start of the semester with the two sisters and their orange, right? If you'll recall, in that situation, there were two women, there was one orange. What they did was cut it in half, thought they came up with a great solution. However, after they cut it in half, they discussed why they wanted the orange, and they discovered one sister simply wanted to eat it, the other wanted to bake with it, only needed the rind. Had they talked about those interests, those reasons why they wanted the orange, rather than just focusing on their position, they both could have ultimately had their goals met, right, and had a win-win situation rather than having to compromise. So it's easier said than done, but I think it's a really good kind of final little nugget or a piece of advice to think about and kind of end this lecture on, just how important it is to focus on interests rather than only our positions. All right, so again, I'm right at 30 minutes here. Better stop. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out.